How does peace become war? How does a world that has just survived the most devastating conflict in human history, a war so terrible that people called it the war to end all wars, find itself marching toward an even more catastrophic global conflict just 20 years later? The answer lies not in a single cause, but in two pivotal moments that intersected to create the conditions for World War II: the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, and the Wall Street crash of 1929. One was a political decision that rewrote the map of Europe and imposed harsh terms on the defeated. The other was an economic catastrophe that destroyed prosperity and hope across the industrialized world. Together, they created a perfect storm of resentment, desperation, and radical ideology that made the Second World War not just possible, but, in many ways, inevitable. The Treaty of Versailles was intended to ensure lasting peace by punishing Germany so severely that it could never again threaten its neighbors. The architects of the treaty believed that harsh terms would satisfy the victorious power's demand for justice while deterring future German aggression. Instead, the treaty created a legacy of bitterness and grievance that German politicians would exploit for decades. It imposed territorial losses, military restrictions, and financial burdens that Germans across the political spectrum viewed as unjust and intolerable. The treaty became a symbol of humiliation that radical movements could rally against, promising to restore German pride and overturn the hated settlement. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 and the Great Depression that followed destroyed the fragile economic recovery that had begun in the mid-1920s. The crash demonstrated the interconnectedness of the global economy and how quickly prosperity could turn to disaster. As banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared, the political stability of democratic governments collapsed. Populations that had endured the hardships of World War I and the difficult post-war years now faced economic devastation that seemed to have no end. In this environment of desperation and fear, extremist movements offering simple solutions and strong leadership gained support they could never have achieved in prosperous times. The intersection of these two events, the political grievances created by Versailles and the economic desperation created by the Depression, provided the context in which Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party could rise to power in Germany. Hitler's message combined promises to overturn the Treaty of Versailles with solutions to the economic crisis, appealing both to wounded national pride and to practical concerns about jobs and survival. Once in power, Hitler pursued policies that directly challenged the Versailles settlement while exploiting the weaknesses of democratic powers still struggling with economic problems. The result was a spiral of aggression and appeasement that culminated in September 1939, when German tanks rolled into Poland and the world descended once again into war. Understanding how one treaty and one crash sparked the next World War requires examining not just these two events themselves, but how they interacted with broader currents in European politics, economics, and ideology. It requires understanding the specific provisions of the Treaty of Versailles and why they provoked such resentment. It requires understanding the mechanisms through which the Wall Street crash transmitted economic crisis across the Atlantic and throughout the global economy. And it requires understanding how political entrepreneurs like Hitler could exploit these conditions to build movements that would ultimately destroy the peace. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the event that had triggered World War I. The choice of date and location, the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles, where the German Empire had been proclaimed in 1871, was deliberately symbolic, intended to emphasize the reversal of German fortunes. The French, who had suffered enormously during the war with much of the fighting occurring on French soil, wanted the treaty signing to be a moment of triumph and vindication. The treaty was negotiated primarily by the Big Three Allied leaders: Georges Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd George of Britain, and Woodrow Wilson of the United States. Each brought different priorities and perspectives to the negotiations. Clemenceau, representing a nation that had been invaded twice by Germany in living memory, wanted to ensure French security through measures that would permanently weaken Germany. Lloyd George sought a balance between punishment of Germany and maintaining a stable European order that would preserve British interests. Wilson advocated for a peace based on his 14 points, which emphasized national self-determination, open diplomacy, and the creation of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. The resulting treaty was a compromise that satisfied no one completely and contained fundamental contradictions. It was harsh enough to create lasting German resentment, but not harsh enough to permanently prevent German recovery. It redrew the map of Europe according to principles of national self-determination, but applied these principles inconsistently, creating new states with significant ethnic minorities and unresolved territorial disputes. It established a League of Nations to maintain peace, but weakened the League by excluding Germany and Soviet Russia, and by the United States' ultimate failure to join. The territorial provisions of the treaty required Germany to cede significant territories. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France, reversing the German annexation from the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871. The Polish Corridor was created to give the new Polish state access to the Baltic Sea, separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany and creating a source of German resentment that would last until 1939. The Saar region, with its valuable coal mines, was placed under League of Nations administration for 15 years, with its coal production going to France as partial compensation for the destruction of French coal mines during the war. The city of Danzig, predominantly German but located at the mouth of the Vistula River that was vital to Polish trade, was made a free city under League supervision. All German colonies were taken away and distributed among the victors as League of Nations mandates, ending Germany's brief period as a colonial power. The Rhineland, the German territory west of the Rhine River, was to be permanently demilitarized and occupied by Allied forces for 15 years. This provision was intended to provide France with security against future German aggression by creating a buffer zone that Germany could not fortify or use as a staging ground for attacks. The demilitarization of the Rhineland became a powerful symbol of German humiliation and would be one of Hitler's first targets when he began challenging the Versailles settlement. These territorial losses meant Germany lost approximately 13% of its European territory and 10% of its population. The lost territories included some of Germany's most productive industrial and agricultural regions. The separation of East Prussia from the rest of Germany by the Polish Corridor created practical difficulties for transportation and administration. More importantly, it created a sense that Germany had been dismembered, that the German nation had been torn apart by vindictive enemies. The military clauses severely restricted German armed forces. The army was limited to 100,000 men, with no conscription allowed. This small professional force was intended to be sufficient for internal security, but incapable of offensive operations against Germany's neighbors. The navy was restricted to a small number of vessels, with capital ships limited to 10,000 tons and no submarines permitted. Germany was forbidden to have an air force. The General Staff, viewed as the brain of German militarism and the institution that had planned and directed German military operations during the war, was to be dissolved. These restrictions were intended to ensure Germany could defend itself against internal threats, but could not wage offensive war against its neighbors. The economic clauses were perhaps the most controversial and most consequential for the interwar period. Article 231, the famous War Guilt Clause, stated that Germany and its allies were responsible for causing the war and all the losses and damages resulting from it. This clause provided the legal justification for reparations, financial compensation, that Germany would be required to pay to the Allied powers. The amount was not specified in the treaty itself, but was to be determined by a reparations commission. In 1921, the commission set the figure at 132 billion gold marks, an enormous sum equivalent to approximately $442 billion in 2024 dollars. The War Guilt Clause and the reparations burden became the most hated aspects of the treaty in Germany. Germans across the political spectrum rejected the claim that Germany alone was responsible for the war. They believed that responsibility should be shared among all the major powers whose diplomatic failures and mobilization decisions had led to war in 1914. The reparations were seen as economically ruinous and motivated by vindictiveness rather than justice. German politicians, economists, and publicists argued that the reparations were unpayable and that attempting to pay them would destroy the German economy and impoverish the German people. The Treaty of Versailles was not the only peace settlement ending World War I. Separate treaties were signed with Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, collectively known as the Paris Peace Settlement. These treaties redrew the map of Eastern Europe and the Middle East, creating new states like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, expanding others like Romania and Greece, and dissolving the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. The cumulative effect was to create a new European order based on principles of national self-determination, but implemented in ways that left many populations dissatisfied and many borders contested. The German reaction to the Treaty of Versailles was overwhelmingly negative. Germans across the political spectrum, from conservatives to socialists, viewed the treaty as a diktat, a dictated peace imposed by force rather than negotiated in good faith. The war guilt clause was particularly offensive, as Germans believed they had fought a defensive war and that responsibility for the conflict should be shared among all the major powers. The territorial losses were seen as violations of German sovereignty and national unity. The reparations were viewed as economically ruinous and motivated by vindictiveness rather than justice. The Weimar Republic, the democratic government established in Germany after the war, was fatally compromised by its association with the treaty. The government had no choice but to sign. The alternative was renewed war against the Allies, which Germany, in its exhausted and defeated state, could not fight. But by signing, the Republican government became associated in many Germans' minds with national humiliation. Right-wing politicians and military figures propagated the stab-in-the-back legend, claiming that the German army had not been defeated in the field, but had been betrayed by politicians, socialists and Jews on the home front. This legend absolved the military and conservative elites of responsibility for the defeat while delegitimizing the democratic government. The economic situation in Germany in the early 1920s was catastrophic. The war had drained German resources and left the economy burdened with debt. The need to pay reparations added to these burdens. When Germany failed to meet reparations payments in 1923, French and Belgian forces occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, to extract payment in coal and manufactured goods. The German government responded with passive resistance, paying workers to strike rather than cooperate with the occupiers. This policy required printing money to pay the workers, triggering hyperinflation that destroyed the value of the German currency and wiped out the savings of the middle class. The hyperinflation of 1923 was one of the most dramatic economic collapses in modern history. At its peak, prices doubled every few days. Workers were paid twice a day and rushed to spend their wages before they became worthless. People carried money in wheelbarrows to buy basic necessities. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 cost 200 billion marks by November. Life savings, pensions and investments became worthless overnight. The psychological impact was profound, creating a generation of Germans who had lost faith in the stability of democratic institutions and the economic system. The middle class, which had traditionally been a pillar of political stability, was devastated and radicalized. The crisis was eventually resolved through a combination of measures, including the Dawes Plan of 1924, which restructured reparations payments and provided American loans to stabilize the German economy. The period from 1924 to 1929, sometimes called the Golden Twenties in Germany, saw economic recovery, political stabilization, and cultural flourishing. Germany began meeting its reparations obligations, though with the help of American loans. American capital flowed into the German economy, financing industrial expansion and public works. Industrial production recovered and exceeded pre-war levels. Unemployment fell. The Nazi Party, which had attempted a failed coup in Munich in 1923, seemed to be a marginal force that had missed its historical moment. Gustav Stresemann, who served as Chancellor briefly in 1923 and then as Foreign Minister until his death in 1929, pursued policies of fulfillment, meeting Germany's treaty obligations while working to revise the most onerous provisions through negotiation. His approach yielded some successes. The Dawes Plan made reparations more manageable. The Locarno Treaties of 1925 normalized Germany's relations with France and Belgium and led to Germany's admission to the League of Nations in 1926. The Young Plan of 1929 further reduced reparations and extended the payment period, but this recovery was fragile and dependent on continued American lending and general global prosperity. The German economy had been substantially rebuilt using short-term American loans that could be called in on demand. Much of the capital inflow was speculative or invested in projects that would not quickly generate returns sufficient to repay the loans. When the Wall Street crash occurred in October 1929, it triggered a global economic crisis that hit Germany with particular severity. The Wall Street crash began on October 24, 1929, a day that became known as Black Thursday. The crash was the culmination of a speculative bubble that had been building throughout the 1920s. Stock prices had risen to levels disconnected from economic fundamentals, driven by speculation and easy credit. Many Americans had bought stocks on margin, borrowing money to invest in the expectation that prices would continue rising indefinitely. When prices began to fall, margin calls forced investors to sell, accelerating the decline and creating a self-reinforcing cycle of panic selling. The initial crash was dramatic. On Black Thursday, October 24th, 12.9 million shares were traded in a single day, a record that overwhelmed the systems of the New York Stock Exchange. Leading bankers met and pledged to support the market by buying stocks, which temporarily stabilized prices. But the respite was brief. On Black Monday, October 28th, and Black Tuesday, October 29th, the market collapsed completely. On Tuesday alone, 16.4 million shares were traded, and billions of dollars in wealth evaporated. By mid-November 1929, the market had lost approximately 30% of its value from its September peak. The crash itself was a financial event, but its significance lay in what followed. The stock market collapse triggered a broader economic crisis that became the Great Depression, the most severe economic downturn of the 20th century. The Depression was not confined to the United States, but spread globally through the interconnected financial and trade systems. Countries that depended on American loans and exports to America found themselves in crisis. The gold standard, which linked currencies to gold and required countries to contract their money supplies when gold reserves fell, transmitted and amplified the economic contraction across national borders. The causes of the Great Depression remain debated by historians and economists, but several factors clearly contributed to its severity and duration. Agricultural overproduction had been depressing farm prices throughout the 1920s, creating rural poverty that limited consumer demand. The unequal distribution of wealth meant that consumption could not keep pace with productive capacity. The richest Americans controlled increasing shares of income, while wages for workers stagnated. International war debts and reparations distorted trade flows as debtor nations tried to export more than they imported to earn foreign exchange for debt payments. Adherence to the gold standard prevented monetary authorities from responding flexibly to economic crisis, as they were required to maintain fixed exchange rates even as economic conditions deteriorated. The impact of the Depression on the United States was severe. Unemployment rose from 3.2% in 1929 to 24.9% in 1933. Industrial production fell by nearly half. Thousands of banks failed, destroying the savings of millions. Homelessness and hunger became widespread. President Herbert Hoover's administration, committed to balanced budgets and limited government intervention, proved unable to address the crisis effectively. Only with Franklin Roosevelt's election in 1932 and the implementation of New Deal programs did the federal government begin active efforts to combat the Depression. But the impact on Germany was even more severe. The German economy had been substantially rebuilt using short-term American loans that could be called in on demand. When American lenders needed their money back after the crash, German borrowers could not pay, triggering bank failures and business bankruptcies. German exports, which had been important to the recovery of the 1920s, collapsed as global trade contracted by more than 50% between 1929 and 1932. Unemployment, which had been relatively low during the Golden Twenties, soared to catastrophic levels. The unemployment figures in Germany tell the story of economic catastrophe. In 1928, approximately 1.4 million Germans were unemployed, representing about 8.4% of the workforce. By 1930, the figure had risen to 3.1 million, or 15.3%. In 1932, more than 6 million Germans were unemployed, representing approximately 30% of the workforce. These numbers do not capture the full human impact: the families dependent on unemployed workers, the businesses that failed, the young people who could not find their first jobs, the professionals who lost their positions and their status. The social safety net was overwhelmed. Unemployment insurance, established in 1927, quickly exhausted its funds. Local governments that provided emergency relief went bankrupt. Private charities could not meet the demand. Soup kitchens and bread lines became common sights in German cities. Homelessness increased as people could not pay rent. Malnutrition and diseases associated with poverty became more prevalent. The psychological impact of mass unemployment, the loss of dignity, purpose, and hope, was as significant as the material deprivation. The political consequences in Germany were catastrophic. The moderate parties that had governed during the Weimar Republic, the Social Democrats, the Catholic Centre Party, and the liberal German Democratic Party, were associated with both the Treaty of Versailles and the economic policies that had failed to prevent or mitigate the Depression. Voters increasingly turned to parties on the extremes, the Nazi Party on the right and the Communist Party on the left. Both offered radical solutions to Germany's problems and rejected the democratic system that had proved unable to deliver prosperity or national dignity. The Nazi Party's electoral rise was dramatic and directly correlated with economic crisis. In the 1928 Reichstag elections, held during the relative prosperity of the Golden Twenties, the Nazis received 2.6% of the vote and 12 seats. In September 1930, after a year of depression, they received 3% and 107 seats, becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag. In July 1932, at the peak of the economic crisis, they received 37.3% and 230 seats, becoming the largest party, though still short of a majority. The correlation was clear. As economic conditions worsened, support for the Nazis increased. The Nazi message was carefully crafted to exploit both the political grievances created by Versailles and the economic desperation created by the Depression. Hitler promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles, to restore German military power, to reclaim lost territories, and to make Germany a great power again. These promises appealed to nationalist sentiment and to the widespread belief that Germany had been unjustly treated after World War I. But Hitler also promised practical economic solutions, massive public works programs that would provide jobs, support for farmers and small businesses, and an end to the economic chaos that had destroyed savings and livelihoods. The Nazi economic program was vague in its details, but powerful in its psychological appeal. Hitler blamed Germany's economic problems on the Treaty of Versailles, on international capitalism controlled by Jews, and on the democratic politicians who had failed to protect German interests. He promised a national revival that would transcend class divisions and unite all Germans in a racially defined national community. His paramilitary organization, the SA or Brown Shirts, provided both an image of strength and order and an instrument for intimidating opponents and creating an atmosphere of crisis that justified radical solutions. Adolf Hitler himself was a gifted demagogue who understood how to exploit the grievances created by Versailles and the fears generated by the Depression. He had developed his worldview in the aftermath of World War I, combining extreme nationalism with racial ideology and anti-Semitism. He believed that Germany's defeat in 1918 had been caused by internal betrayal by Jews and Marxists, that the Treaty of Versailles was a criminal injustice, and that Germany's future required territorial expansion to the east to provide living space for the German people. These beliefs were not responses to economic crisis, but core convictions that shaped his political goals. The path to power for Hitler was not straightforward. Despite the Nazi Party's electoral success, Hitler was not initially appointed chancellor through democratic processes. The conservative German establishment, including President Paul von Hindenburg and his advisors, distrusted Hitler and sought to keep him from power. They attempted to govern through a series of minority governments that relied on presidential emergency decrees rather than parliamentary support. These governments included those led by Heinrich Brüning, Franz von Papen, and Kurt von Schleicher, all of which proved unable to address either the economic crisis or the political instability. The political situation in Germany from 1930 to 1933 was chaotic. The Reichstag was paralyzed, unable to form stable governing coalitions. The presidential governments ruled by emergency decree, suspending normal parliamentary procedures. Street violence between Nazi stormtroopers, communist militants, and other political groups became routine. The Weimar Republic's democratic institutions were collapsing under the weight of economic crisis and political extremism. Finally, on January 30th, 1933, Hindenburg appointed Hitler as chancellor in a coalition government, with conservatives holding most of the other cabinet positions. The conservatives believed they could control Hitler and use his popular support while constraining his radical impulses. Franz von Papen, who became vice-chancellor, famously boasted that, "We have hired him." This proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Within months, Hitler had consolidated dictatorial power through a combination of legal maneuvering, intimidation, and violence. The Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933, provided Hitler with a pretext for emergency measures. Hitler claimed the fire was the beginning of a communist uprising and persuaded Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended civil liberties and allowed the government to arrest political opponents. In the weeks that followed, thousands of communists, social democrats, and other opposition figures were arrested and imprisoned. The SA and the newly formed SS conducted a campaign of terror against anyone who opposed the Nazi regime. The Enabling Act, passed by the Reichstag on March 23, 1933, gave Hitler the power to enact laws without parliamentary approval for 4 years. The act effectively ended parliamentary democracy in Germany and established Hitler's dictatorship. The vote was 444 to 94 in favor, with only the Social Democrats voting against. The Communists were already banned, and other parties were intimidated or had calculated that cooperation might protect their interests. By the summer of 1933, all other political parties had been banned or dissolved. Trade unions had been suppressed, and Germany had become a one-party state. Hitler's economic policies in the first years of his rule appeared successful, at least superficially. Massive public works projects, including the construction of the Autobahn highway system, provided employment and created visible evidence of national revival. Rearmament, though initially secret to avoid violating the Treaty of Versailles, created industrial demand and jobs. The regime organized leisure activities through the Strength Through Joy program and provided social programs that created an appearance of national solidarity and care for workers. Unemployment fell dramatically, from over 6 million in 1932 to less than 2 million by 1936, and virtually zero by 1938. These achievements were financed through deficit spending and accounting gimmicks like MIFO bills, a form of promissory note that disguised government debt. The Nazi economic program was not sustainable in the long term. It would ultimately require either repudiation of debts or conquest of foreign resources to sustain. But in the short term, it created genuine popular support for the regime by delivering on promises to restore prosperity and national pride. Many Germans who had been skeptical of Hitler's extremism were won over by economic success and by the sense that Germany was becoming strong and respected again. Hitler's foreign policy directly challenged the Treaty of Versailles from the beginning, testing whether the international order established in 1919 could be maintained. Each challenge was carefully calibrated to exploit weaknesses in the Versailles system and divisions among the victor powers. Each success emboldened Hitler and demonstrated that aggression could succeed without serious consequences. In October 1933, Germany withdrew from the League of Nations and the Geneva Disarmament Conference, rejecting international arms control and asserting Germany's right to rearm. This was a direct challenge to the premise of collective security that underlay the post-war order. The League protested but took no action. Britain and France, while concerned, were not prepared to use force to compel German compliance. The withdrawal demonstrated that the League had no effective mechanism for enforcing its decisions against a determined violator. In 1935, Hitler announced the existence of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles, which had forbidden Germany from having any military aircraft. He also introduced military conscription, expanding the army far beyond the 100,000-man limit imposed by the treaty. These announcements were deliberate provocations intended to test whether Britain and France would enforce the treaty terms. They protested, but did nothing to reverse the violations. Britain even signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in June 1935, which allowed Germany to build a navy up to 35% the size of the British fleet, effectively endorsing German violation of Versailles. The most dramatic early challenge came in March 1936, when German forces remilitarized the Rhineland. Under the Treaty of Versailles, the Rhineland was to remain permanently demilitarized, German territory, but forbidden to contain German military forces or fortifications. This provision had been designed to provide France with security, ensuring that German forces could not mass on the French border. The remilitarization was a gamble for Hitler. German forces were still weak, and if France had responded with military force, Germany would have been compelled to withdraw. But France, divided politically and focused on domestic problems, did nothing beyond diplomatic protests. The remilitarization of the Rhineland was a turning point. It demonstrated that Hitler could violate the Treaty of Versailles with impunity. It showed that France, despite having the military power to stop Germany, lacked the political will to act. It encouraged Hitler to pursue more aggressive challenges to the international order, and it began the process of building fortifications in the Rhineland that would make French military intervention much more difficult in the future. The Western democracies' failure to enforce the treaty terms had multiple causes, all related to the intersection of Versailles and the Depression. Britain and France were still struggling with economic problems and unemployment. Their publics, traumatized by the losses of World War I, strongly opposed military intervention and feared another war. Many British politicians and intellectuals believed that the Treaty of Versailles had been too harsh and that some German grievances were legitimate. There was sympathy for the argument that Germany should be allowed to rearm to some degree, and that the military clauses of Versailles were both unjust and unenforceable in the long term. Moreover, there was a widespread belief in Britain and France that a strong Germany could serve as a buffer against Soviet communism, which many in the West feared more than German nationalism. Hitler skillfully exploited this fear, presenting himself as a bulwark against Bolshevism and suggesting that Germany and the Western democracies had common interests in containing Soviet expansion. This argument appealed to conservative politicians and business leaders who saw communism as a threat to their interests. The policy of appeasement, which came to define British and French responses to German aggression in the late 1930s, was rooted in the experiences of World War I and the Depression. Appeasement was not simply cowardice or naivete, though it certainly involved misreading Hitler's intentions. It reflected genuine war weariness, economic constraints, and a belief that some revision of the Versailles settlement was justified. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, the figure most associated with appeasement, believed he was preserving peace through reasonable compromise, not enabling aggression. The Depression reinforced reluctance to confront Germany by creating pressing domestic problems that demanded attention and resources. Military spending competed with social welfare spending and economic recovery programs. Rearmament required borrowing and budget deficits at a time when orthodox economic thinking emphasized balanced budgets. For democratic governments facing elections, the immediate needs of unemployed workers and struggling businesses took precedence over hypothetical future threats from Germany. The Austrian Anschluss in March 1938, when Germany annexed Austria, represented another major revision of the Versailles settlement. The Treaty of Versailles and the associated Treaty of Saint-Germain had forbidden the union of Germany and Austria, fearing that such a union would create a German state too powerful for European stability. Hitler, himself Austrian by birth, had long desired to incorporate Austria into Germany. When he sent German troops into Austria in March 1938, they were greeted with enthusiasm by many Austrians. Britain and France protested, but took no action to reverse the annexation. The Anschluss brought several benefits to Germany. It added territory and population, expanded the German military, and provided access to Austrian gold reserves and industrial capacity. It also improved Germany's strategic position, surrounding Czechoslovakia on three sides and providing better access to southeastern Europe. The success of the Anschluss without serious international opposition encouraged Hitler to believe that the Western democracies would not fight to prevent further German expansion. The Munich crisis of September 1938 brought Europe to the brink of war. Hitler demanded that the Sudetenland, the German-speaking border regions of Czechoslovakia, be incorporated into Germany. Czechoslovakia, which had significant military forces and border fortifications, was prepared to fight to defend its territorial integrity. The crisis seemed likely to trigger a European war, as France was allied with Czechoslovakia and Britain supported France. But at the Munich conference on September 29–30, 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Édouard Daladier agreed to German annexation of the Sudetenland in exchange for Hitler's promise that this was his last territorial demand in Europe. Czechoslovakia was not invited to the conference where its fate was decided. When Chamberlain returned to London, he waived the agreement and proclaimed, "Peace for our time." The Munich Agreement represented the culmination of appeasement. It was justified as a reasonable compromise that satisfied a legitimate German grievance. The Sudetenland was indeed inhabited by ethnic Germans who had complaints about treatment by the Czechoslovak government. It was presented as preventing war and preserving peace, but it also demonstrated that Hitler could achieve his goals through intimidation without fighting, that international agreements and alliances meant nothing when tested, and that small states could not count on support from the great powers. Within 6 months, the hollowness of the Munich Agreement became apparent. In March 1939, German forces seized the remainder of Czechoslovakia, destroying the Czech state and establishing a German protectorate over Bohemia and Moravia. This action could not be justified by claims of uniting ethnic Germans. The Czechs were a distinct people with no historical connection to Germany. Hitler had revealed that his ambitions extended far beyond revising the Treaty of Versailles to recovering German populations. He sought to establish German domination over Central and Eastern Europe, regardless of the wishes or rights of the peoples living there. The destruction of Czechoslovakia was the moment when British and French policy shifted decisively. Chamberlain and Daladier finally recognized that Hitler could not be trusted, that his ambitions were unlimited, and that further concessions would only invite further aggression. Britain and France issued guarantees to Poland, promising to defend Polish independence if Germany attacked. They began serious rearmament programs, though these came too late to create military forces capable of effectively opposing Germany in 1939. Hitler's next target was Poland, and specifically the Polish Corridor and the Free City of Danzig. The Polish Corridor had been a source of German resentment since 1919, as it separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany and had been carved out of German territory to give Poland access to the sea. Danzig was a predominantly German city under League of Nations supervision. Hitler demanded that Poland return Danzig to Germany and grant Germany extraterritorial rights across the corridor. Poland, backed by British and French guarantees, refused. The final peace fell into place on August 23, 1939, when Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Nazi-Soviet Pact, a non-aggression agreement that included secret protocols dividing Poland and Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Stalin, who had been excluded from the Munich Conference and distrusted the Western democracies, calculated that an agreement with Germany would buy the Soviet Union time to prepare for eventual war while allowing it to recover territories lost in 1918-1920. On September 3, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. Britain and France, honoring their guarantees, declared war on Germany on September 3rd. World War II had begun, just 20 years and 2 months after the Treaty of Versailles was signed. The war that would kill an estimated 70 to 85 million people, destroy cities across Europe and Asia, and culminate in the Holocaust and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had its origins in the punitive peace of 1919 and the economic catastrophe that began in 1929. The recognition that the Treaty of Versailles and the Great Depression were central causes of World War II came gradually and shaped how the victorious Allies approached the post-World War II settlement. The lessons learned from the interwar period influenced decisions about how to treat defeated Germany, how to organize the international economy, and how to create institutions to preserve peace. The most fundamental lesson was that a punitive peace settlement that humiliated the defeated power without permanently disabling it created conditions for future conflict. The Treaty of Versailles had been harsh enough to create lasting resentment, but not harsh enough to prevent German recovery and rearmament. After World War II, the Allies initially considered even harsher measures, including the Morgenthau Plan to permanently deindustrialize Germany and reduce it to an agricultural economy. But ultimately they rejected this approach in favor of a policy that combined temporary occupation and denazification with long-term economic reconstruction. The Marshall Plan, announced by Secretary of State George Marshall in June 1947, provided massive American economic assistance for European reconstruction, including to the western zones of occupied Germany. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States provided approximately $13 billion in assistance, equivalent to roughly $150 billion in 2024 dollars. This policy represented a deliberate rejection of the approach taken after World War I, when the United States had demanded repayment of war loans while Germany struggled under reparations burdens. The Marshall Plan recognized that European economic recovery was essential, both for preventing the conditions that had enabled extremism in the 1930s and for creating stable democratic societies that would resist Soviet communist influence. The decision to divide Germany into occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, and eventually to create two separate German states, represented another lesson from the interwar period. A united Germany had proved capable of dominating continental Europe militarily. Division ensured that no German state would have the resources to threaten its neighbors. The Federal Republic of Germany in the West was integrated into Western European economic and security structures, beginning with the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951 and continuing through the European Economic Community and NATO. This integration meant that German economic and military power would be embedded in multilateral institutions rather than exercised independently. The second major lesson was that international economic cooperation was essential for preventing economic crises that could destabilize democratic governments. The breakdown of the international trading system during the Depression had contributed to economic nationalism and autarkic policies that made war more likely. After World War II, the Allies created new institutions designed to promote international economic cooperation and prevent a recurrence of the Depression. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, both created at the Bretton Woods Conference in July 1944, were designed to provide stability to the international monetary system and to provide financing for reconstruction and development. The IMF would help countries maintain stable exchange rates and overcome short-term balance of payments problems, lending foreign exchange reserves to countries experiencing currency crises. The World Bank would provide long-term financing for reconstruction and development projects. Together, these institutions, known as the Bretton Woods system, would promote international economic integration and reduce the likelihood of the competitive devaluations and trade wars that had characterized the 1930s. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, negotiated in 1947, created a framework for reducing tariffs and other barriers to trade. GATT represented a conscious rejection of the protectionism that had deepened the Depression and contributed to international tensions in the 1930s. Through successive rounds of negotiations, GATT members gradually reduced tariff barriers and increased international trade. The liberalization of trade contributed to the rapid economic growth of the 1950s and 1960s, creating prosperity that supported democratic stability. The third lesson was that collective security required institutions with real power to prevent and respond to aggression. The League of Nations had failed because it had no military force of its own and required unanimous decisions, allowing any member to veto action. The United Nations, created in 1945, was designed to be more effective. The UN Security Council, with its 5 permanent members having veto power, could authorize military action to maintain peace. While the veto power would prove problematic during the Cold War, preventing UN action in many conflicts, the UN framework at least provided mechanisms for international cooperation that had not existed in the League. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, established in April 1949, created a military alliance that committed the United States to the defense of Western Europe. Article 5 of the NATO Treaty stated that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all, committing the alliance to collective defense. NATO represented a fundamental shift in American foreign policy, from the isolationism that had kept the United States out of the League of Nations to permanent engagement with European security. The alliance meant that any aggressor contemplating expansion in Europe would face not just the military forces of individual European nations, but the combined might of the alliance, including American nuclear weapons. The presence of American forces in Europe under NATO provided both deterrence against Soviet aggression and reassurance to European countries that feared German resurgence. The commitment was credible in ways that French and British guarantees to Poland in 1939 had not been, because American forces were actually stationed in Europe and would be immediately involved in any conflict. This commitment addressed the security dilemma that had helped drive German rearmament in the 1930s. Germany had claimed it needed military forces to defend itself against potential threats, but German rearmament had threatened its neighbors. NATO created a security architecture in which countries could be confident of their defense without needing to rearm to threatening levels. The fourth lesson was that democracy required active cultivation and support. The Weimar Republic had failed in part because democratic institutions were weak and democratic culture was shallow. After World War II, the Allies, particularly the United States, invested substantial resources in promoting democracy in occupied Germany and Japan. This included political education programs, support for democratic parties and institutions, and constitutional designs that learned from the failures of Weimar. The basic law adopted by the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949 incorporated features designed to prevent the failures that had undermined Weimar democracy. The constructive vote of no confidence meant that Parliament could only remove a chancellor if it simultaneously elected a replacement, preventing the governmental instability that had plagued Weimar. The 5% threshold for parliamentary representation meant that small extremist parties could not gain seats, encouraging coalition building among larger moderate parties. The Constitutional Court had the power to ban anti-democratic parties, and it exercised this power against both a neo-Nazi party and the Communist Party in the 1950s. The federal structure and the inclusion of basic rights that could not be amended ensured that even a democratic majority could not establish dictatorship. The thesis that the Treaty of Versailles and the Great Depression were the primary causes of World War II has been extensively debated by historians. While these factors were undeniably important, critics have pointed out that this explanation risks oversimplifying a complex historical process and potentially absolving Hitler and the Nazis of responsibility for deliberate choices to pursue aggressive war. The first major criticism is that focusing on Versailles and the Depression can make Hitler's rise to power seem inevitable, as if economic and political conditions automatically produced Nazism and World War II. This deterministic interpretation overlooks the role of human agency and contingency in history. Hitler was not simply a product of conditions, but a uniquely dangerous individual whose decisions shaped events. The Nazi Party was not the automatic result of economic crisis, but a specific political movement that made strategic choices about tactics, messaging, and alliances. Other democracies experienced the Depression without turning to fascism. Why did Germany respond so differently? Alternative outcomes were possible at multiple points. If conservative German politicians had not appointed Hitler as Chancellor in January 1933, believing they could control him, the Nazi seizure of power might not have occurred. If President Hindenburg had not signed emergency decrees that suspended civil liberties, or if the Reichstag had not passed the Enabling Act, Hitler's path to dictatorship would have been more difficult. If different economic policies had been pursued in response to the Depression, if Germany had abandoned the gold standard sooner, if governments had pursued more aggressive deficit spending to combat unemployment, the crisis might have been less severe and the appeal of extremist parties reduced. Research by historians like Richard Evans has shown that the Nazi rise to power was not inevitable, but resulted from a series of contingent decisions and miscalculations by conservative elites who underestimated Hitler and believed they could use him for their own purposes. The business leaders who funded the Nazi Party, the military officers who believed Hitler would restore German military power while remaining under their control, the conservative politicians who thought they could manipulate Hitler while constraining his radical impulses, all of these groups made choices that enabled Hitler's seizure of power. These were human decisions, not inevitable consequences of economic conditions. Moreover, the focus on Versailles and the Depression as causes of World War II can obscure the specific ideological content of Nazism. Hitler was not merely a nationalist seeking to revise an unjust treaty or an economic manager responding to crisis. He was a racial ideologue committed to creating a German empire based on racial hierarchy, to eliminating Jews from Europe, and to conquering vast territories in the East for German settlement. These goals were not caused by Versailles or the Depression, but stemmed from Hitler's worldview formed in the aftermath of World War I and developed in the 1920s. Hitler's book Mein Kampf, written in 1924 during his imprisonment after the failed Munich Putsch, laid out his ideological goals clearly. He wrote about the need for Lebensraum, living space for the German people to be conquered in the East. He advocated the elimination of Jews, whom he blamed for Germany's defeat, and for Bolshevism. He rejected democracy, and advocated authoritarian leadership. These ideas predated the Depression and were not responses to economic crisis, but core convictions that would shape Nazi policy once Hitler gained power. The second major criticism is that the Versailles Depression thesis can minimize the responsibility of other actors for the outbreak of war. Britain and France pursued appeasement, not merely because of war weariness and economic problems, but because of failures of leadership and judgment. Neville Chamberlain misread Hitler's intentions, believing he could be satisfied with reasonable territorial adjustments when in fact his ambitions were unlimited. British and French military leaders overestimated German military strength and underestimated their own, contributing to reluctance to confront Hitler. Intelligence failures meant that British and French leaders did not understand the degree to which Germany was preparing for aggressive war. The Soviet Union's role in the outbreak of World War II is also obscured by exclusive focus on Versailles and the Depression. Stalin's decision to sign the Nazi-Soviet pact in August 1939 was crucial in enabling the war to begin. The pact gave Hitler confidence that he could attack Poland without facing a two-front war. It divided Poland and Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence, with both powers agreeing to partition Poland. Stalin made this decision based on calculations about Soviet security and opportunities for territorial expansion, recovering territories lost after World War I. The pact was a cynical exercise in power politics that facilitated German aggression. The Japanese expansion in East Asia, which was part of World War II, though it had roots independent of European developments, cannot be explained primarily through Versailles or the Depression. Japanese militarism and imperialism had deep roots in Japanese history and politics, including the belief that Japan needed to create an autarkic economic bloc in Asia to ensure access to resources. While the Depression affected Japan and contributed to political instability that enabled military domination of the government, Japanese aggression in Manchuria beginning in 1931 and in China beginning in 1937 was driven by factors specific to East Asian international relations. The relationship between the Treaty of Versailles, the Great Depression, and World War II is complex and multifaceted. These two events, one political, one economic, did not simply cause the war in a straightforward manner. Rather, they created conditions and dynamics that made the war possible and shaped how it developed. Understanding this relationship requires recognizing both the power of structural conditions to shape historical outcomes and the role of human agency in making choices within those conditions. The Treaty of Versailles created a Germany that was weakened but not destroyed, humiliated but not reconciled to its defeat, bound by restrictions it resented but capable of eventually overcoming them. This was perhaps the worst possible outcome from the perspective of maintaining peace. A Germany that had been treated more generously, with a settlement that Germans could accept as just, might have developed a stable democracy with less resentment toward the international order. A Germany that had been treated more harshly, perhaps divided into smaller states or permanently occupied, might have been unable to threaten its neighbors. Instead, the treaty created a Germany nursing grievances and awaiting opportunities for revision. The territorial provisions that separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany, the military clauses that prevented Germany from defending itself adequately while leaving it vulnerable to neighbors it had recently fought, the reparations that drained German resources without permanently preventing recovery, and above all the war guilt clause that blamed Germany alone for the war. All of these created resentments that could be exploited by political entrepreneurs. The treaty was not negotiated with Germany but imposed upon it, creating the perception of a diktat rather than a negotiated peace. The Great Depression provided the conditions in which exploitation of these resentments could succeed politically. The Depression did not make Nazism inevitable, but it made Nazi appeals to nationalism and promises of economic revival effective in ways they had not been during prosperous times. In 1928, when Germany was relatively prosperous, the Nazis received less than 3% of the vote. In 1930, after a year of depression, they received over 18%. In 1932, at the peak of economic crisis, they received 37%. The correlation was clear and powerful. The Depression also weakened the democratic powers and reduced their willingness to confront German violations of the treaty. Britain and France, struggling with their own economic problems and unemployment, had neither the resources nor the political will to enforce treaty provisions. Their publics, traumatized by World War I and facing economic hardship, strongly opposed military action. The result was a policy of appeasement that made rational sense in terms of avoiding war, but that in practice encouraged German aggression by demonstrating that violations of international law would not be punished. Together, Versailles and the Depression created the context in which Hitler could rise to power and pursue his ideological goals of racial empire and continental domination. But Hitler was not merely a product of these conditions. He made choices that transformed possibilities into realities. He chose to pursue aggressive expansion rather than accepting Germany's position in the international order. He chose to implement genocidal policies against Jews and other groups he deemed inferior or threatening. He chose to launch wars that would kill tens of millions of people and ultimately destroy his regime and devastate Europe. The lessons learned from this period shaped the post-World War II settlement and remain relevant today. The importance of generous treatment of defeated powers, the necessity of international economic cooperation, the value of strong institutions to maintain collective security, and the need to actively support and defend democracy. All of these lessons came from reflecting on how the Treaty of Versailles and the Great Depression had contributed to World War II. The Marshall Plan's investment in European reconstruction, rather than demanding reparations, the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions to manage the international economy, the establishment of NATO to provide collective security, and the active promotion of democracy in occupied Germany and Japan, all reflected learning from the failures of the interwar period. These policies were remarkably successful in creating a stable, prosperous, democratic Western Europe that has not experienced major war since 1945, a striking contrast to the European experience in the first half of the 20th century. But these lessons must be applied carefully and with recognition that historical circumstances differ. The conditions that produced World War II were specific to their time and place. Not every economic crisis will produce fascism. Not every peace settlement that the defeated perceive as harsh will lead to revanchist war. Not every nationalist movement will pursue genocidal expansion. History provides lessons, but it does not provide simple formulas that can be mechanically applied to different circumstances. Each situation requires careful analysis and judgment about which historical parallels are meaningful and which are misleading. The story of how one treaty and one crash sparked the next World War is ultimately a story about how political decisions and economic systems shape the possibilities for war and peace, how leaders exploit conditions to pursue their goals, and how small decisions and failures of judgment can accumulate into catastrophic outcomes. It is a reminder that peace is not a natural state that simply occurs when war ends, but an achievement that requires constant effort, wise leadership, and institutions that can manage conflicts before they escalate into violence. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919, with great ceremony and hopes that it would ensure lasting peace. 20 years and 2 months later, on September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland and World War II began. The short span between these dates and the direct connections between the treaty, the crash, and the war stand as testaments to how quickly peace can collapse when its foundations are weak, when economic systems fail, and when leaders emerge who are willing to exploit grievances and fears to pursue aggressive ambitions. The memory of this period reminds us that the preservation of peace requires more than the absence of war. It requires just settlements that address legitimate grievances while constraining potential aggressors. It requires economic systems that provide prosperity and stability rather than boom and bust cycles that breed desperation. It requires democratic institutions strong enough to resist extremism and wise enough to address the problems that extremists exploit. It requires international cooperation and collective security rather than narrow nationalism and isolationism. These requirements are demanding, and democratic societies often struggle to meet them. The temptation to pursue short-term advantages rather than long-term stability is constant. The difficulty of maintaining international cooperation when national interests diverge is real. The challenge of sustaining prosperity while managing capitalism's inherent instabilities continues. The appeal of simple nationalist messages over complex international cooperation remains powerful. Yet the alternative, allowing conditions like those of the interwar period to develop again, is too terrible to contemplate. The Second World War killed an estimated 70 to 85 million people, including approximately 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust and millions of others who died in genocides, forced labor, bombing campaigns, and military operations. It destroyed cities, devastated economies, and traumatized entire generations. It demonstrated what happens when a punitive peace settlement and an economic crisis create conditions that extremists can exploit, when democratic institutions prove too weak to resist takeover, when international cooperation fails, and when aggression is not confronted until too late. The Treaty of Versailles and the Wall Street crash did not make World War II inevitable. Alternative outcomes were possible at multiple points between 1919 and 1939. But these two events created conditions that made the war possible and shaped how it developed. Understanding this relationship helps us understand not just what happened between 1918 and 1939, but what is required to prevent such catastrophes in the future. The lessons are complex and sometimes contradictory, but they share a common theme. Peace is fragile, and its preservation requires wisdom, courage, and sustained commitment to the values and institutions that make civilized international relations possible. The cost of failure, as the interwar period demonstrated so tragically, can be measured in tens of millions of lives and the destruction of civilization itself.